travel back to 1962. I'm a high school kid with a part-time job at a neighborhood supermarket, a family-operated affair known as Evergreen Finer Foods. Evergreen Finer Foods was a longtime fixture at the northeast corner of Belmont and Broadway in the North Side Chicago neighborhood known as Lakeview. Been there since 1941. That corner is now occupied by a Walgreens, a faceless, soulless Walgreens, like any other. You know, seen one, you've seen them all. The brick and mortar are just a memory. But despite their absence, I have very cherished recollections of those days. I remember a lot of the customers, most of whom were likable, but a few not so much. And then there were my fellow part-timers, including Eleni, who worked the registers. And Eleni was a fellow nerd and once upon a time girlfriend. We shared our love of books. But my keenest memories are those of my three bosses, Little George, Eddie, and Sparky. Now, Little George was, as his name implies, very short of stature, but compact. He was bald as a baby's bottom, with a little pencil-thin mustache, and a Napoleonic complex. Little George was the store manager, and he wanted everyone to know it. His voice would echo throughout the market, as did his cornball sense of humor. Like, he'd see a mother with a newborn baby in the buggy, and he'd sidle up to them. He'd stick his head in the buggy, and he'd make cooing sounds at the little kiddo inside the buggy. Coochie coo, coochie coo, coochie coo. Stick his head out of the buggy again. Hey, Mama, can I take the baby home with me? And he'd see a regular customer leaving the store with her groceries. He'd yell after her, "Good day, Mrs. Weinstein. Take care of myself." Corny. But with those of us who had to work with him, he wasn't always so nice. He'd think nothing of, like, without missing a beat, he'd sneak up behind one of us guys, could be any one of us, grab him by the testicles, and he'd yell out, "Take a bow, take a bow." Now, remember, this is 1962, and nobody ever thought to blow the whistle on this guy. That's just the way things were, you know? And, you know, those were the good old days. You know, back when America was great. But then there was Eddie. Eddie was the supervisor of us high school kids. He was the stock manager. And now Eddie was in his late 20s, had this shock of curly hair and very jovial nature. And he had migrated from West Virginia a few years before and spoke with a down-home twang. And Eddie loved to make up words. Like whenever I'd report for work, he'd greet me thusly. "Hey there, Daniel. How's the old spinameningitis?" I just kind of shrugged my shoulders and I'd say, "Oh, I don't know, Eddie. Still spinning, I guess." And every once in a while, Eddie liked to make like he was a drill sergeant, and he'd bark orders at us, but always in a very playful way. He'd say, "All right now, boys, let's get them cans of Hawaiian Punch up on the shelf, on the double." Now, Eddie and little George, they didn't get along. And every once in a while, they'd exchange words. It was never anything serious, just, minor scraps. And in the wake of one of their arguments, Eddie would calm himself down by reciting a couplet that he made up about little George. "Hair don't grow where the brains is dead. That's what's wrong with George's head." And then he'd chuckle and he'd recite that same couplet once or twice, and then he'd be ready to carry on with his work. Now, one other thing about little George, he was a practical joker. Now, back in 1962, and a lot of you might remember when soda pop came in glass bottles. And customers would leave a deposit whenever they purchased the pop. And it would be like 5 cents for a quart bottle and 2 cents each for the smaller bottles and the 6-packs. And whenever the customer would return the bottles empty, they'd get their deposits back. So the way things worked, we let the return bottles accumulate in shopping carts, maybe 2 or 3 cartfuls, and we'd wheel them to the back of the store, to the foot of the stairs leading to the basement, which is where all the pop bottles were stashed until they were picked up. Now, the staircase leading down to the basement was steep and narrow, and there was no room for a conveyor belt. So the way we got the bottles downstairs, someone would stand at the top of the steps and toss the bottles down. Single quart bottles or 6-packs. And someone else would be at the bottom of the steps catching. So on this particular day, little George was standing at the top of the steps, lobbing the bottles down to me. And all of a sudden, I see this 6-pack of Hires root beer coming toward me, and it bounces off the wall. George he had a wild pitching arm. A major leaguer he wasn't. So this 6-pack ricochets off the wall, and I have to make a running leap in order to retrieve it. So George yells down to me, "Hey, nice save, Malacca." I yell back up at him, "Hey, George, what does Malacca mean?" He yells back down, "Why, it means friend." Okay. Later that afternoon, I was working with Sparky. Sparky was in charge of dairy, frozen food, spices, and a number of other items. And he was a very, very affable guy. Somewhere in his 30s, had a high forehead, close cropped hair, and a congenial manner, but also very earnest. Now, as a teenager, Sparky had emigrated from the Greek state of Sparta. And maybe that's why he was called Sparky, I'm not sure. But his real name was Spiros. Everybody called him Sparky. So I'm helping him restock a dairy case. And I ask him, "Hey, Sparky, what does Malacca mean?" And he momentarily recoils. Huh? Who used that word? Who used that word? I told him that it was George. And he said that Malacca meant friend. Oh, that son of a gun. That son of a gun. Here, come close. I'll tell you what Malacca really means. I'll whisper. Malacca means jack off. Good old George. 36 years later, it's December 1998, December. And Evergreen Finer Foods has shut its doors for keeps, forever and ever. And a couple weeks later, the wreckers arrive with this massive bulldozer with an enormous claw attached. And I'm standing across Belmont Avenue, and I'm watching, feeling very forlorn as this big bulldozer takes great big chunks out of the east wall of what's now the corpse of Evergreen Finer Foods. And there's snowflakes dancing around too. But as the bricks and the mortar and the plaster plummet to earth, they set up a large cloud of smoke arising from the wreckage. And from within that cloud of smoke, I can hear voices, the voices of Sparky and of little George and Eddie, voices from a time long gone. The first voice I hear is that of Sparky. Here, come close. I'll tell you what that word really means. A whisper. In 1967, Sparky opened a storefront hot dog joint on the northwest side. And he never, ever served ketchup with his hot dogs. Not in Chicago. In the ensuing years, Eddie grew homesick for West Virginia. His home state beckoned him home. Eddie lost his life in a hunting accident. He was 40 years old. Rest in peace, my friend. And I was left with his voice. It was a kind of a gossamer voice. All right now, boys. Let's get them cans of Hawaiian Punch up on the shelf, on the double. And that's my last memory of Eddie. Then last of all was Little George. Little George, if he's still alive, would be maybe 105, 106. Hey, George, wherever you may be. Oh, I forgot his voice. I forgot. I could hear him saying, "Good day, Mrs. Weinstein. Take care of myself." And that was the last voice I heard. Little George, wherever you may be, take care of myself. Take care of yourself as well. Just take care. Take good care. Thank you.